You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra, again. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
Just another day in paradise, like I say every week.
Yeah.
The year's gonna be gone here pretty soon.
Already October.
So today's topic is probably the most common thing I see. I don't follow a whole lot of Facebook groups, but there's a few groups that I see, I guess, the questions. But the most common question is toxic mold testing and understanding the lab results. It is, and most of the time in these groups, it's always an ERMI test. And our listeners probably know how I feel about the ERMI test. I'm not against it. I don't understand why people would go out and just buy a test that only gives that minimal information and then go to a Facebook group and ask what we all think.
And I think you did 2 episodes on the ERMI, didn't you? On the top.
Yeah, way back.
So if you want to know how Steve feels about it, go way back. There are 2 episodes dedicated to discussing it.
Yeah, we did one this year, the Emma versus the ERMI.
Oh, that's right.
And for our listeners that are like, well, this is the first time I'm listening. What's wrong with an ERMI? The ERMI test this is one of the reasons I don't like it, is I feel like it's sold as a DIY test that's going to answer all your questions. And I don't think it answers a whole lot. And there is no mold test out there that you can do on your own that's going to answer all the questions.
That's true.
Period.
That's true.
Like every time somebody asks in a Facebook group, it's the same answers all the time. Hire an IEP. That's always my question. Like, what did your inspection reveal? Mm-hmm. Because that test should have been part of an inspection. But the ironic part is I don't know many professionals that do an ERMI test.
Yeah.
There's a few. I'm not going to say nobody does it. Most of us do other tests. But my point is, for our listeners, there is no silver bullet test out there, and I've said that numerous times, that's going to answer all of your questions. But, and we'll talk about it again at the end of the episode, if you're going to go out and buy an ERMI test, you might as well buy an EMMA, E-M-M-A. If you're going to do a DIY test, you might as well do an EMMA. An ERMI's not going to answer enough questions, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So what kind of tests should people be getting?
So we've talked about this before. My clients that are listening that have had us come on site and do inspections know this very well. But it's very difficult to tell our listeners what tests they should do without the inspection. So the way I operate, I believe this is the way most IEPs operate. I don't know. I can't speak for them. We do the inspection. Then when we're done with the inspection, I sit down with my clients, how many ever there are, and we go over everything and I tell them, this is what I should do. And my point is, and to answer your question, it's never the same thing. If we find visible mold, maybe we'll do a surface sample, which is a tape lift. If we don't find any mold, maybe we'll do an air test. And when we do an air test, we have to do one outside and then one inside. Typically for an air test, we're going to do 3 or 4 of them. But my point is we don't know for sure what type of test we're going to do.
Okay.
But I'll explain kind of quickly for our listeners. We have what I call traditional mold testing. To me, that's a non-viable, cheap. It's the cheapest type of testing that we do. Traditional testing would be air testing, tape lifts, swabs, or bulk samples. A bulk sample, for those listening that are like, what is that? We can literally take a piece of building material, whether I've sent hay in before. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
We had a client that we thought maybe was being exposed feeding their horses. But a bulk sample, you can literally cut a piece of sheetrock out, take a piece of insulation, many things. That's what a bulk sample is. But anyhow, a traditional test only tells us the mold types. And obviously I'm not a biologist, so I'm probably not going to say these terms right, but that's at the genus level. If we want to know if it's a toxic mold or not, we have to know the species. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So a traditional test is just going to say it's Aspergillus. As a matter of fact, a traditional test actually classifies Aspergillus and Penicillium in the same category.
Okay.
Because they look so similar.
Huh.
And they're just going to give us a raw count and a spore count. The raw count is literally how many ever they see under the microscope, then they multiply it by whatever equation, which is typically the milliliters of air that we were running through the pump. I'm not going to get into all that. But my point is, for our listeners, the traditional testing is the cheapest because it's the easiest. You get the results the quickest, and it doesn't always answer all of our questions.
Okay.
So you can do that, and then you can do what we call qPCR testing. That is like an ERMI, an EMA. They actually report the mold species.
Okay.
So for our listeners, like there's Aspergillus versicolor, there's Aspergillus niger, there's all sorts of Aspergillus species. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When we do a traditional test, we don't even know the species. Why does the species matter? That's what we have to know to determine if it's a toxic mold. That was probably not the best explanation, but clear as mud,
well, and
right?
I guess clear as mud, but people want to really understand, like, what kind of test should they be asking for? I mean, obviously, there's a whole medical side to testing, and then there's an indoor air quality side of testing. What should they do first?
I think they should have the IEP first.
Okay.
And the IEP, once again, this is a hard question to answer because I'm speaking to how I do things. But as an IEP, you know this, I have a questionnaire for my clients. And, if I don't do that for like a consultation, I ask them, like, have you had any ERMI tests? Have you had any EMA testing? Have you had any mold testing? Have you had any mold inspections? Have you done any medical testing? I get all their information. And as you say, it's my CSI investigation because that's how I approach it. So for our listeners, we do want to see the medical side of it. Mm-hmm. Also, we're obviously not medical professionals, but I work with medical professionals. So for our listeners on the medical side, because they're probably like, well, we want to know, there are several different labs that you can do on the medical side. As our listeners who've listened for a long time know, I've interviewed Dr. Fox, Dr. Diane. Heather, the health coach, is more on the medical side too, but they all have differing opinions. But here's from what I've heard from the doctors I work with, and from my experience, the best tests are the Vibrant Wellness, which is a urine test. Dr. Fox will use that test unprovoked. She has told me if she does provocation, she will do the real-time lab test. And for our listeners, you can go back. First episode with her was 213, and then we did one this year, and I can't remember what episode number it is, but they can find that. But my point is you really have to work with a medical professional.
Absolutely. Well, but that leads me beautifully in the next question, which is you're saying, okay, if you need to do medical testing, you should work with a qualified, licensed medical professional. But what about the people who are in their minds are going, I want to DIY mold test my house. Like, can I just do it on my own, get it done?
You can. I wouldn't recommend it, but you absolutely can. You can do an unprovoked real-time lab urine test. You can buy an EMA test from Real-Time Labs. So just to be clear with our listeners, one's a medical test, medical mycotoxins, and then the EMA is an environmental mold and mycotoxin assessment. They're completely different things. One, you have to give urine. The other one, the EMA test, you gather dust like an ERMI. You can, for our listeners, they can do that on their own. But once again, here's, and I just had a client not too long ago, we went down to Colorado. And when they asked me questions, I would say to them, so what would be the purpose, and this is how I deal with all my clients, what would be the purpose of us doing an EMA test? And, they sat there and they're like, well, to see if there's mycotoxins. And I'm like, well, you've already done the medical. So we already know you have mycotoxins in your body. We found visible mold. So what's the reasoning behind it? And my whole point for our listeners is, what's the reason behind it? So if I tell you to go do a medical mycotoxin test and then an EMA, if you need, my point is this, if you need remediation, you should probably move to that step. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. But to answer your question, they can do the real-time lab urine test. Some insurance covers it. Mm-hmm. You don't have to have a prescription. Now, to be clear, there's Vibrant Wellness, Mosaic, which used to be Great Plains Lab. There's Real-Time Lab. There's MyMyco Lab, Sunrise Labs, and LabCorp. I think those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head from the medical side. Some of those do require a prescription, or what's it called?
I don't know.
They have to get from the doctor.
Yeah, a prescription.
So it would be called, yes. I didn't know if that's what it was called.
Absolutely.
But my point is, to our listeners, some of them you do have to have that. So you have to work with a doctor. Now, on the other hand, like Real-Time Lab, you don't have to. So going back to what your question is, my whole point is, for our listeners, at the end of the day, we're probably going to tell you need an inspection.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
An inspection tells you a lot more. Testing alone can't give you the full picture.
Exactly. Like, even if our listeners do an EMA test, and they do the medical mycotoxin testing, and we can literally see in their home, these mycotoxins are there, these mold species that produce that type of mycotoxin are there. Then we can see on the medical side, it's in their body. Yeah, we can say, hey, it's in your home. But my point is, most of the time, you need remediation.
Yeah.
And you know how I feel about that.
Absolutely.
Like, don't spend a ton of money
on testing. Yeah, like get the real work done.
Exactly. Then we can go down that road. So for our listeners, though, if they're like, well, I don't think I have any problems, and, how do I know if the mycotoxin test on the medical side, how do I know if I'm being exposed at home? Could be at work, could be at school, could be many places. Then maybe we would do some air testing or do other tests. But what I want our listeners to understand is I can't, behind a microphone or a consultation or a phone call, I can't tell you everything you're going to need to know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So given everything you've shared today, what's your call to action for people?
Make sure, so we already talked about hiring a doctor and hiring an IEP. Make sure you get the proper professionals involved. You could go to your MD or your normal doctor. If they can't answer your questions, you're going to have to go to a functional medicine or, another route. Both Dr. Diane and Dr. Fox, they have online things you can do. I guess my point is there are options. There are Dr. Schumacher's, I don't know if it's certified or recommended physicians, but make sure you get a physician that knows what they're doing.
Okay.
And then, like we mentioned, we talked about the EMA test. You can buy those directly from our site. For our listeners, you literally go to the website, mycotoxin tab, you purchase it. We literally notify the lab. They send you a kit. You gather the dust. Once you get the kit, actually, we send you our own instructions on top of the lab's instructions. Anyhow, you gather the sample. You send it to the lab. It's in a prepaid envelope. Once I get the results, I analyze them. I write up my report. I send you as the client, I send you the 2 lab reports, which is a mycotoxin report and a fungal count, so the mold species, and then I send you our report. So you'll get 3 documents. And for the price, I think, what is it, $450?
Something like that.
And you can buy it for $400 from the from the lab. So
yeah, but getting the interpretation from you is super important.
Exactly.
So definitely go to cnccontractorservices.com and purchase your Emma.
Exactly. And I guess my point is for the listeners, you can buy it for $50 cheaper right from the lab, but for the extra $50, you get me involved in it.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Like Cassandra said, you can go right to our site and buy that. I'll put a link in the podcast description. But thanks for all of you for listening. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.